Today is the first day of 2019, but the last day of Kwanzaa, which celebrates African American heritage. Kwanzaa was first celebrated 52 years ago. It was created by Ronald McKinley Everett, who goes by the name Maulana Karenga. Maulana Karenga invented Kwanzaa as an alternative to Christmas. He is an outspoken leader in the Black Power movement. He's called Jesus a psychotic and referred to Christianity as a white religion. While the holiday has spread to Canada and Brazil, some African Americans have big problems with the holiday, not because of what it represents, but because of who created it. It is estimated that Kwanzaa's popularity has declined over the years, with some estimates of only 500,000 African Americans currently observing it. For more on this, we are joined by Bruce A. Dixon. He is managing editor of Black Agenda Report. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Dave.
You're down in Georgia.
Atlanta, Georgia, yes, sir.
Where the devil went down and changed his name to Kemp. You don't, anything? Nothing? No laugh?
Nothing on that one.
Okay, that's how it's going to be. Okay, you write over at the Black Agenda Report that you don't celebrate Kwanzaa specifically because of Maulana Karenga, the guy who created it. Karenga is currently the chair of the Africana Studies Department at California State University, Long Beach. He's written countless books on Pan-African studies. He holds 2 PhDs. He claims to be a political prisoner, having served 4 years behind bars at the California Men's Colony, where he became a feminist. Before we get to your issues with him, have you ever met the guy? What kind of life is he leading right now?
I've never met him. To my knowledge, I've only been in the same building with him one time, and I'm from Chicago. In the 90s, I was working in City Hall, and they pulled together this thing called the Black Radical Congress, which is supposed to be a national gathering of black activists, a sort of an umbrella thing. And I remember walking in the door and paying my $25 or whatever it was and getting the program, and then I saw his name on the top of the program, and I just had to turn around and walk out.
Well,
that was the closest I ever got to meeting the guy.
Dr. Henry Louis Gates puts him up as an authority on the struggles of black Americans. He's well respected, isn't he? I mean, he teaches. He's doing very well for himself.
Well, the authorities are always naming our spokespeople and naming the keepers of our history. That's what they do. They blessed and anointed Ta-Nehisi Coates as some kind of black spokesman. They've blessed and anointed Henry Louis Gates himself. And so it's not surprising they get to pick the leaders that they want and the spokespeople they want and the historians they want. I mean, real history is supposed to teach people how to interpret the present and where to go from here. So that's not the kind of thing that you can leave to oppressed people to determine for themselves. You've got to give them guidance. And so Mr. Karenga has been bestowed upon us, and he's been blessed by all the proper authorities. Here he is.
In your piece over at the Black Agenda Report, you say you're happy for people who get something from Kwanzaa, and you write, quote, "It's true enough that Kwanzaa is now bigger than the crimes of its founder and will outlive him." So I'm going to ask you about the crimes of Karenga in a second. But first tell me what Karenga got right with Kwanzaa and why it caught on, and do you think it will be celebrated 50 years from now? Because it does seem to be on the decline.
Well, I'm not a prophet, and I've lived long enough to be wrong a lot. so I'm rather loath to make predictions about things that are not even that important to me, and whether people celebrate Kwanzaa 50 years from now is not really that important to me. What he did get right is that people do love a good story, and people do love ritual, and people have a need for ceremonies and celebrations. And so there was a blank space in there, and he came up with something that filled that blank space for some people. There you go. Even the stop clock is right twice a day.
Thank you for your restraint. We'll get to the crimes of Karenga in a second. Give us a little context. What was the organization known as US? Who headed it? And What was the difference between us and the Black Panther Party? Did they work together? How did they get along?
I was a rank-and-file member of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party in Chicago in 1969 and most of 1970.
So did you know Fred Hampton?
Absolutely, yes.
All right, let's
You can,
stop. Let's talk.
Google my name and Fred Hampton's name, and you can find something that I did there for the 40th anniversary of his death. Next year will be the 50th anniversary, and we're planning to do a series of celebrations and commemorations in Chicago in which I and many other people are going to be involved in. So, yeah, Fred was a comrade of ours. Yes, sir.
Okay, so very, very quickly, let's just take a little detour for a second. I didn't know that you knew Fred Hampton. Who was Fred Hampton? How old was he when he died, and why was he killed?
Fred Hampton was 21 years old when he was killed. Fred Hampton was born in Louisiana, and his family came up to Maywood, which is in the poor western suburbs of Chicago. And Fred had a desire to help humanity. And he was a great student and a natural leader. He was organizing high school students in Proviso East High School, and he was the youth chairman of the NAACP, for his area there. And he was, very smart academically and sports and the rest of that stuff, a natural leader. But instead of taking the obvious and short road, to an elite college, the ministry or something like that, he chose to cast his lot on the west side of Chicago, working for the betterment of humanity and founding and leading the Black Panther Party in Illinois. And that's how we spent the last couple of years of his life. And the last year of his life was the whole time that I knew him. He was our chairman, our deputy chairman in Chicago.
Who killed Fred Hampton?
The FBI, COINTELPRO, America's political police, with the aid of the Chicago Police Department. It's one of those complicated and convoluted assassination stories that you read about. For instance, he was murdered December 4th, 1969, and there was a squad of Chicago cops who were supposedly detailed to the state's attorney's office. State's attorney is what you call the district attorney in a lot of places. And they, walked in. They walked in on the apartment and sprayed a couple hundred rounds on sleeping people. Apparently, Fred had been drugged the night before by an informant named William O'Neill, who also gave the FBI the floor plan of the apartment, including the spot where he would be sleeping. And so they sprayed bullets. They killed two people, Mark Clark, who was on the front door, and Fred, and they wounded 6 or 7 other people. There were a total of 9 people in the apartment, and they were all swept up. And there were lawsuits and such for years. Oh, the leader of the police group was supposedly a Chicago police sergeant named Daniel Groth, Groth. A few years later, when the family was suing the FBI and the Chicago Police Department, it turned out that no such police sergeant as Daniel Groth ever existed, and his badge number never even existed either. Although somebody with Daniel Groth's face was seen a couple of years later among some of the FBI shooters at Wounded Knee. So there are many, many connections. The family eventually did sue, and after a decade, they got a pittance of a settlement from the government. The only way that they got this was there was a burglary in an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, which revealed the existence of the COINTELPRO program. Some activists in Media, Pennsylvania burglarized an FBI office and removed a trove of documents, which referred to other documents that the FBI and the Chicago police and other agencies of the government had for 10 years insisted did not exist. And it was these documents that revealed for all to see the actual extent and existence of the COINTELPRO program. If it were not for that burglary of the FBI office, we would not really know about COINTELPRO. The government would still be denying it. It would still be classified.
What is the FBI's official stance on the death of Fred Hampton? Because they have kind of come clean on the letters sent to Martin Luther King and his wife with the pictures of him with other women and the audio tapes of him with other women and letters that FBI agents wrote to Dr. Martin Luther King telling him to commit suicide. I think the American government has pretty much come clean on that. Did they ever acknowledge their involvement with the death of Fred Hampton? Or do they have an official cover story?
I'm not certain that they have publicly acknowledged it, but there has been a lawsuit where they've paid out a single-digit number of $1 million to, some of the family and some of the survivors. But I'm not aware that they have fully accepted responsibility for the murders of Mark Clark and Fred Hampton. And I'm certain that COINTELPRO involved other murders. In terms of letters, the most famous letters, at least famous in Chicago, were some notes that were also originated through the FBI that were written to gang leaders, supposedly from Fred Hampton, and then some others that were supposedly from the gang leaders to the members of the Black Panther Party, in which the FBI was trying to incite some kind of conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody seems to know about those. But as far as the government taking responsibility for its secret political police and their operations against people pursuing their legitimate political objectives in the United States, hold your breath, wait for that one.
COINTELPRO, what was it? When did it start? Was it primarily the FBI? Were they working with the CIA? What exactly was COINTELPRO?
Well, nobody really knows what goes on, totally behind closed doors, but the FBI traditionally has been the United States of America's political police from its very, very inception. J. Edgar Hoover was one of the founding directors of the FBI, and what they were about was about hunting down communists and hunting down people to be deported in the Palmer raids in 1919 to make America safe for World War I.
Mm-hmm.
And so the FBI had by the time the Black Panther Party came about in the 1960s, the FBI had been for decades in the business of suppressing and punishing and tracking political dissent in this country. So COINTELPRO was simply their program that focused on black folks in the 60s and the movement of the 60s.
How did you meet Fred Hampton?
It was January 1969. I was living in Chicago on the South Side, and I decided to join the Black Panther Party. I walked into the office and said, I want to enlist. And they told me what to do, and eventually I did wind up meeting Chairman Fred, as we called him, among others.
What was US?
US was an organization. US was the organization headed by Ron Karenga. Sometimes they said that US stood for United Slaves, and sometimes when they were trying to be clever, when you asked them what US meant, they would say, well, US is we, and we, us. So that's what they were. They were us. They were them. For us, they were not us. They were them. There were some fundamental philosophical differences between the Black Panther Party and us. The Black Panther Party was groping towards socialism. My job in the Black Panther Party in Chicago was helping teach the political orientation classes at 2350 West Madison Street on the west side of Chicago. We taught Marx and Lenin and Paulo Freire and the rest of this. We taught historical materialism, and we taught socialism. If you look at, there's a movie called The Murder of Fred Hampton. There was a crew filming a documentary on the party and on Fred at the time he was murdered. And they turned that documentary into something called The Murder of Fred Hampton, which you can find free on YouTube nowadays.
I watched it a year ago with my son. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in it a couple places. Okay, I got no lines. But,
okay.
But when you hear Fred talking, he's talking about socialism. He says, he talks about an international proletarian revolution. That's the language that he used. He's talking about socialism. Now, on the other hand, us and we, or Ron Karenga's outfit, was definitely against socialism. They definitely preached against any kind of class struggle orientation. Their view was that people free themselves by throwing off the culture of, and changing their culture. That
pulling up their pants.
We called them cultural nationalists. And we called ourselves revolutionary internationalists and socialists. And so there were fundamental philosophical differences between us. And besides the fundamental philosophical differences between us in Los Angeles, where there actually was an us organization, those fundamental philosophical differences were also piled upon by, some practical close-up flesh and blood differences that ended up with the murder of several members of the Black Panther Party. John Huggins and Bunchy Carter were murdered in a cafeteria.
I'm going to ask you about that in a second.
Sure.
The Black Panther Party started in Oakland and spread to Chicago and around the country. Us, I would assume, since Karenga was from L.A., it started in L.A. Did it spread to Chicago? How big did us get?
No, we never saw those folks in Chicago. So, fortunately for everybody, we never saw them in Chicago.
And is Karenga about the same age as Fred Hampton?
Well, they say when you die young, you don't age.
Right.
So, so Fred is still 21, and Mr. Karenga has to be in his late 70s, or he might even be 80 by now. I don't know.
Okay, so let's talk about
he's definitely enjoying an undeserved victory lap.
Yeah. Let's talk about us and the piece you have written over at the Black Agenda Report. You say that Karenga worked with COINTELPRO.
It's very clear, yeah. It's very clear that his organization was used by COINTELPRO, and he allowed this to happen. And besides his philosophical...
Allowed what to happen?
He allowed his organization to be used in this way. He allowed his followers to be manipulated into threatening people and eventually murdering 4 members of the Black Panther Party that we know about.
Al Prentice, Bunch Carter, John Huggins, Sylvester Bell, and John Savage. Why don't we go through who these people were? Who was Al Prentice Bunch Carter?
Bunchy Carter.
Bunchy
Carter was, you can contrast him really to Fred Hampton. Al Prentice Bunchy Carter was one of the founders, was one of the founding organizers of the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles, along with Geronimo Pratt. And he had been part of the Slawsons, which is a street organization, and he politicized part of the Slawsons, and then they split off and became the Renegade Slawsons.
Well, I got to interrupt you because a lot of my listeners have a comedy background like me. When you say the Slawsons, you're talking about the Slawson cutoff, where you cut off your Slawson from The Tonight Show, right? You know what I'm talking about?
That's California stuff, bro. I ain't on that. I don't know nothing about that one.
That's from the Johnny Carson show. He always used to say, take the Slawson cutoff and cut off your Slawson. So there was actually a gang called the Slawsons?
Absolutely.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes, sir.
And that would be South Central, right?
I'm not much on L.A. geography. I've only set foot in L.A. a couple of times in my life for no more than a weekend. So I am really hazy on that.
Okay, so go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
If we were talking New York or Chicago, I could give you chapter and verse.
Okay.
This block means that and that, but L.A. I can't do it. So.
Yeah.
But the Slawsons were what you would call a gang, yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Or in Chicago, sometimes we call them street tribes. And Al Prentice Bunchy Carter was one of the leaders of it, and he did some time and got out and decided that he wanted to do some good, and he became political. He was also an accomplished vocal stylist and a poet, and he was recruited into the student body at UCLA by Judge Joe Brown, as a matter of fact. Judge Joe Brown, they say, was the BSU coordinator from UCLA, and it was his job to recruit promising black students. And he recruited both Bunchy Carter, he says, and John Huggins.
Yeah, and who was John Huggins?
John Huggins was another leading member of the Black Panther Party in Southern California.
And when did Bunchy Carter and John Huggins die, and how did they die?
I believe it was 68, and they died. They were shot to death in front of 40-some witnesses in a cafeteria on the UCLA campus by members of the US organization. But where I was going to go, though, we talked a few moments ago about Fred Hampton and about Fred Hampton's appeal to some of the gangster folks in Chicago, and how the FBI and the local police thought this was a very, very, very ominous and threatening development. Well, the difference here was, and the similarity between Bunchy Carter and Fred Hampton, one in Chicago and one in L.A., is that Fred was not a member of these organizations. Fred was an outsider, trying to politicize the street tribes, whereas Bunchy Carter was very, very much an insider. So,
right. Karenga, who gave us Kwanzaa, did he order the hit on Bunchy Carter and John Huggins? Do we know?
I certainly don't know. I'm sure there's people who do know, but I'm not one of them. And, if you're the captain of the ship and the ship goes this way, the organization goes that way, you walk around for the rest of your life smiling about it, then, it's a reasonable supposition that you had a lot to do with this.
Could this be something as simple as turf war, that us didn't want the Black Panthers moving in on the realm?
Well, I wouldn't pull it down that way. No, the Black Panther Party was a political party and a political organization with a 10-point political platform and program. And, its objectives were far, far different from those of us. So
why would us kill Black Panthers?
Because the only reason for us to kill Panthers would be that if they were in the service of someone else, because their own interests didn't necessarily conflict with the Black Panther Party, but the interests of the government, which doesn't want people to self-organize, which doesn't want people to think about class struggle, and doesn't want people to oppose capitalism, and who found our 10-point political platform and program. Our political platform and program, for instance, called for resisting the war in Vietnam at that time. It called for the dismantlement of most of America's prison systems. Mm-hmm. It called for an end to the robbery by the capitalists of our black communities.
Right.
These are not things that us necessarily had a quarrel with, but they are things that the government had plenty of quarrel with.
Right.
It means that this is not a turf war, because those objectives never infringed upon the turf of Mr. Karenga's organization. They interfered with the turf of the government. They interfered with the turf of the ruling class in this country, which found a way to employ people like Mr. Karenga to do their bidding.
I see.
So it's not a turf war. It's something else.
We're talking about Karenga. He created Kwanzaa. He also founded US. And what was in it for him specifically if Bunchy Carter and John Huggins were assassinated? Money? US would become what if it worked with the government? What incentivized him?
Well, I guess on one level, I suppose they would be recognized as the representatives of black folks on the UCLA campus and politically. So there would be a small amount of patronage that they would get from that, maybe some jobs, maybe some contracts. Certainly after Karenga was arrested, and he did not do he was sentenced to 4 years, but my understanding is he only did 1 year out of the 4 for torturing two female members.
Well, let's
of
get
his
to
own
that. Let's get to that.
organization.
Let's get to that in a second.
Well, no, the reason it's relevant is because you asked, what did he get? Okay, what he got is he got his sentence shortened from 4 years to 1 year, and then within 2 months of his release, he got hired tenure track for a professorship in the University of California system, from which he recently retired.
Right.
So that's what he got. Got a claim, he got tenure, he got a life, and he got a little patronage. So there you go.
Bunchy Carter and John Huggins were killed before Karenga was accused of those crimes, right?
This is true, yes.
So what did he want at the time that they were killed? What was he thinking? What do you think his dream was? I don't think his dream was to go to a men's colony in California.
I could not say. I just could not say.
Right.
He was not serving his own interests. He was serving the interests of America's political police.
Right.
So there you go.
Who was Sylvester Bell and John Savage?
Sylvester Bell and John Savage were two lesser-known members of the Black Panther Party. One was in the San Diego area, I believe, and their murders are also widely believed to be credited to members of US.
And does US still exist? How big did it get, and when did it all peter out?
I could not tell you that, but I can tell you that, to my knowledge, certainly it does not exist anymore. There are a number of people who used to be part of it who tell stories, and a few of them have written books, some of them quite critical of Mr. Karenga and his misdeeds. If you want to look for them, they're out here.
Why did Karenga go to prison?
He eventually went to prison. He was convicted of torturing two female members of his organization. He and his wife took part in the torture. You know, that's what he went to prison for. Oh, also, US was very patriarchal too. You know, part of their cultural nationalist ideology, you know, basically posited the superiority of men over women and black men over black women. You know, and that was a core part of their belief. You know, and so when there were disagreements and some of these women came under suspicion, it was fine and dandy, according to him and some of the folks in the organization, for these women to be tortured. And so that's why he adds Karenga. I mean, I've heard it said that he says that in prison he repented and became a feminist. So that's what you got to do. You got to torture women and go to jail for it, and then you come out saying you're a feminist. Yeah, right.
And he's never once apologized for any of this.
He's never said or spoken a word that would even lead anyone to hint that he takes any responsibility or feels any regret over these things that happened half a century ago.
He was convicted of kidnapping and torture, and he did do his time.
He did a piece of his time. They said he was sentenced to 4 years, but he only did one. And like I said, he was immediately hired tenure-track professor by the UC system, you know, within 40 or 50 days of his release, which is kind of remarkable. Mm-hmm. Who else does that happen to?
He claims he was a victim of COINTELPRO.
Yeah, that kind of figures, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does. I guess I won't wish you a Merry Kwanzaa.
Happy holiday. All right.
The war on Kwanzaa continues.
It's not a war on Kwanzaa. You know, I mean...
I'm trying to give it a Fox News spin.
No, let's not give it a Fox News spin. Let's not legitimate Fox News at all.
They don't bring this up. We were talking before we started that Fox News will attack Kwanzaa, but not for the right reasons. They don't go after Karenga for being a tool of J. Edgar Hoover's.
Precisely. They just paint him as a black clown. Mm-hmm. But a lot of us don't see anything funny here. And, you know, for those who get something positive out of Kwanzaa, bless them, you know, and we are happy for them. But, you know, for us who were the comrades of the people whom Mr. Karenga murdered, while they are celebrating Kwanzaa, we're going to hold high the legacy of the folks who were killed. We're going to hold high the legacy of our comrades, John Huggins and Bunchy Carter, Sylvester Bell, and John Savage. We're just going to hold that high. And happy holidays.
Bruce A. Dixon is managing editor of Black Agenda Report. You also have a radio show. How do people listen to your radio show if it's not on in a city near you?
Well, what you want to do is you want to go to blackagendareport.com and you want to subscribe. Hit the subscribe button, smash the subscribe button, and the subscribe button will get you every week a free email newsletter that has links to all our printed and audio material that is issued every week. Back 3 years ago, when they first started this fake Russiagate scare, and they first started tarring people on the left, saying that this one and that one were under the influence of Russians, Black Agenda Report was the first to be targeted with that slur and with that slander. And ever since then, Facebook and Google have suppressed the appearance of our material in search results and in Facebook stuff and in commercial social media. So the only way you can be sure that you're getting fresh news, commentary, and analysis from the Black Left each week from Black Agenda Report is to go to our site and hit the subscribe button so that we send you our stuff by email direct to your inbox.
So you're being accused of being a front organization for the Russians?
The way they put it is that we are carrying the Russian line or carrying water for the Russians, or we sound like the Russians because we're for peace, okay? And because, we're, against war. This is the lazy liberal slur that Democrats and Cold War liberals, cruise missile liberals, I like to call them, are levying against the authentic left in this country. If you're for peace, you must be influenced by the Russians. That if you question the economic system of this country, if you're for single-payer health care, or better yet, for a national health care service, if you're against the dismantling of the VA, if you're for housing for everybody, then obviously you didn't think of these things all by yourself. The Russians must have planted these funny ideas in your head. Here we are.
Here we are. You'll come back?
If I'm invited.
You're invited. Bruce Dixon, managing editor of the Black Agenda Report, blackagendareport.com. Can you stay on the line for 1 second?